Good evening, Key Biscayne. My name is Andrea Aga. I am the village manager. Tonight with us, we have Mayor Davey. Thank you for joining. And Vice Mayor Moss, thank you for joining us. And if any other council members are joining or do join, I will acknowledge them and thank them for their support of the staff and what we're doing here. So with me, I have Dr. Roland Samimi, our Chief Resilience and Sustainability Officer, as well as Mr. Jake Osman, the engineer, our Public Works Director, and our Director over the Building Department. So tonight is the second of a series of 4 town hall events that we are hosting. Our objective is to help educate and inform the community about the project that we are trying to move forward under the resilience program. And tonight's topic is focused on probably the least controversial and most uniting topic behind all of us, which is our precious, precious beaches. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Samimi. We have a PowerPoint presentation. So if you're watching on channel 77, or if you're watching us through our YouTube channel, thank you for joining in that way. If you want to call in to have any questions answered later or Pete can call out the information now. I ask that we allow staff to get through the entire presentation, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll open it up for Q&A. So if Pete, you could kind of call out the rules of engagement here with regard to the meeting and how people can participate, and then we'll kick it over to Dr. Samimi.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. When the question and answers portion does come up, please dial 305-365-7569, and you'll be prompted to put in a meeting ID. The meeting ID number is 231-627-8415. Those of us watching right now on channel 77 and AT&T channel 99, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see those numbers. Also, if you do wish to speak, please press *9 once you've logged in to raise your virtual hand. And I will be calling on you on the last 3 digits of your phone number.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Kulpa. And I would like to also acknowledge Councilmember Petros. Thank you for joining us this evening. And Dr. Samimi, take it away.
Okie dokie. Thank you, Andrea. Much appreciated. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully this will work correctly. Let's see what happens. Share. Okay. Can someone just acknowledge that that actually is visible?
Looks great.
Looks good.
Okay, so what I would like to stress, obviously, today is August 20th. It's our second town hall, and it's focused on protecting the villages, beaches, and shoreline, which is one of 3 programs under the overarching umbrella, which is our resilience general obligation bond sort of umbrella. There are 2 other programs, one which is related to sea level rise and flooding, and that's going to be discussed, I believe, on September 3rd. And then the 3rd program under the umbrella, our resilience umbrella, is going to be discussed on September 17th, and that's going to be focused on hardening infrastructure to the effects of hurricanes. So with that said, I'm just going to move on to this next slide, hopefully. Why is this not moving on? Oh, here we go. Okay. So before we really start talking about shoreline protection and strategies for shoreline protection and what is applicable to Key Biscayne, I thought that it might be useful to provide a little bit of environmental context for shoreline protection. It's important. There are physical factors, natural physical factors that affect our decisions relative to shoreline protection. There are also ecological or biological factors that are also natural that affect our shoreline protection management strategies. And there are also factors that are human affected. And all of these things work together. They're interconnected and create for a relatively complex set of equations and calculations that need to be worked through to determine what's the best approach for protecting the shoreline in a particular area versus another. So some of the physical, ultimately, let me just step back for just a second. Shoreline protection is really about managing energy. And why manage energy? Well, because managing energy is what is ultimately leading to erosion of the shoreline. And so when you're looking to protect the shoreline, you're looking to reduce erosion. And so to reduce erosion, you're looking to manage energy. And there are physical factors that drive this erosion, that drive this energy situation. And one of the factors, which is a geologic factor, is the depth of bedrock offshore of the shoreline that you're looking to protect. So on the right side of this image, of this slide, you see what is essentially contours of bedrock elevation. And in the red circle, you notice that the elevation of the bedrock is actually much deeper than the adjacent area to the north and to the south. Now, why is that important? Well, because that would suggest that there are softer sediments above that bedrock, and this is a very dynamic environment, and those sediments can shift around, which then affects the depth of water in that area, the depth of the overlying water over the sediments in that particular area. And what you notice on the left is essentially a depiction of the bathymetry, the depth of water offshore of Key Biscayne's beach. And what you notice is that there's this sort of like indentation, excuse me, there's this sort of indentation where you have deeper water pushing up closer to shore than areas to the north and to the south. Now, that's interesting because that has an effect on waves, and waves carry the energy that are getting focused or directed onto the shore that is being eroded away. And we'll get to that in a second in another slide. But so you have this interplay between depth of bedrock, which is a geological consideration, and then depth of water, which then relates to the waves. But there's also this other physical factor, which is the bottom characteristics, what the actual bottom of the seabed, ocean bed, looks like and feels like. And so you have hard bottom and high relief, or you have hard bottom and low relief, where you have soft bottom that's sandy, or you have soft bottom that's vegetated. I'm going to move on to the next slide because it describes it a little bit better. This is actually a survey that was done of the hard bottom characteristics off of Key Biscayne. It was done by the Army Corps of Engineers back in 1996. And what it shows is that there's clearly a band of offshore reefs that is your hard bottom with relatively high relief. It's also considered your first line of defense and is your first opportunity to dissipate energy out of the waves that are coming from the ocean and then engaging with the shoreline of Key Biscayne. Then as you move westward towards Key Biscayne, you see another area of hard bottom. It's characterized by low relief, so it has a little bit less capability of extracting energy out of the waves before they come ashore onto the beach. And what's not shown here, but does exist, is a bottom that is not hard. It's soft and sandy in certain areas. And then in other areas, it's soft and sandy, but it's vegetated. And those are the seagrass beds that you are familiar with when you go to the beach and you swim out a little bit and you come across all this naturally occurring seagrass. That's those beds. And why is that important? Seagrass beds, while not a great energy dissipator. It is an energy dissipator, but not as great as, say, a hard bottom that's high relief. Those seagrass beds stabilize the sediments, the sand that would otherwise be as the energy of the waves is transferred through the water and starts engaging with the bottom. And so that's why I was saying earlier that everything is connected. Well, the bathymetry is connected and relates to the waves and the amount and the size of the waves that can come ashore. The waves coming through the reefs have energy taken out of them to varying degrees depending on how healthy the reefs are, how high the reefs are. Then ultimately the energy comes towards the shore and starts passing over a sandy bottom and starts shifting sand all over the place. But if that sand is being held by seagrass, then it doesn't shift nearly as much. And again, remember, the story here is about energy and erosion. So now moving on, and we start thinking about now this wave energy coming ashore. On the right, you see measurements of the likelihood of the direction that waves come ashore over the course of, say, a period of time. I think in this case, it was like over the course of a year-long period, what it shows is that the majority of the wave direction, as opposed to the wave size, but here it's wave direction. The majority of the wave direction most of the year is from the northeast or from the southeast, which is really kind of interesting considering what the bathymetry looks like and how it's sort of like a funnel that is moving energy directing energy into what would essentially be an erosional hotspot, which is Key Biscayne Beach. And that sort of lines up with the majority of the direction of waves over the course of a year being from the northeast and the southeast. And obviously it relates to wind direction as well and wind intensity. But then ultimately what you end up with is a situation where this energy is being focused onto Key Biscayne Beach. The energy then starts moving the sediments to the north towards Bear Cut Channel and to the south towards Cape Florida Channel, which is what these arrows on the left side of the screen show. It's the sand movement away from Key Biscayne Beach to the north and away from Key Biscayne Beach to the south towards these channels. And as sea level rises and storms intensify, the energy onto this beach increases, and so does the erosion. And that's why, we're thinking to ourselves, okay, well, what to do about shoreline protection looking forward in terms of resiliency and sea level rise and climate change and all this stuff. And the last piece of this little puzzle that we're talking about relative to energy and erosion is water movement and tidal currents. And all of that happens naturally. I mean, tides are the tides, right? The moon is the moon. But now we have affected how water and energy that water movement represents. We've affected that essentially by how we've modified the land we live on. And so this is actually kind of an interesting figure, because what it shows is historic shorelines and how they've changed over time. And so this is over a period from 1852 to 1987. And so the red line is the shoreline as it was established in 1852. And at that time, what you'll notice is that the southern tip of Miami Beach was actually part of what is now Fisher Island, and Government Cut didn't exist. There was Norris Cut that separated basically South Miami Beach from Virginia Key, and then there was Bear Cut that separated Virginia Key from Key Biscayne. Well, both Norris Cut and Bear Cut exist today, except they're not quite the same as they were in 1852. And why is that? Well, because in 1904, Government Cut was dredged out, and so it opened up a new a new avenue for water to flow back and forth between the bay, but it also interrupted sand transport from the north, because that's generally in this area how sand moves. It moves from the north to the south. And so that interrupted sand supply to Virginia Key. And so what you see in the blue line is 1919 Shoreline, which shows the very beginnings of government cut. Obviously, it was a lot smaller then than it is now. And you see the resulting change in the shoreline on Virginia Key and the resulting change of the shoreline on Key Biscayne. And so you notice that in the area of Key Biscayne, excuse me, the area of Key Biscayne Beach, say between marker T100 and marker R105, that shoreline clearly has migrated landward, and also the southern end of Key Biscayne has changed from what it was in 1852, and by 1919 it sort of represents what it exists like today. But my point in sharing this is that it's all about energy, water movement, putting energy into the shorelines, creating areas of deposition or erosion of the shoreline. And it's something that has to be factored as you start looking at shoreline protection strategies. Now, we're not really going to be able to do anything to change the back and forth of water from the bay to the ocean, but nevertheless, it affects sand transport, and that affects the shoreline that we're trying to protect. So with that said, what are the various shoreline protection strategies? Well, they vary based on your geography and where you are. And I'm not going to get into all the fine print that is below, which are essentially the materials options for each shoreline strategy and the benefits and disadvantages. But what I wanted to sort of stress is that there are living shorelines that are on the greener side, the more sort of natural side. And then gradually, as you move to the right, you get into grayer type shoreline protection strategies. And I didn't include the ones that are all the way gray to dark gray, which is like concrete, seawalls and stuff like that, because it's not really applicable to Key Biscayne Beach. So I'm not, so I didn't bother to present them. But the ones that are particularly interesting to us, because it's sort of what we do and what we would like to do, is beach nourishment over to the left, which is something that everyone is relatively familiar with because it's been happening on Key Biscayne since essentially 1969. Beach nourishment with vegetation on dunes, which is the whole emphasis on dune restoration, which, back in the 1970s when I was a kid, there really weren't any dunes on the beaches of Key Biscayne, Crandon and Cape Florida was undeveloped, but pretty much Key Biscayne Beach didn't have any dunes. There was seawalls. And over time, what happened is that nature took its course, and nature is much stronger than we are, and those seawalls just gradually crumbled, and environmental regulations evolved to the point that we couldn't replace the seawalls with new seawalls, but rather the seawalls were replaced with dunes, because we'd evolved and we'd learned that dunes were actually very effective natural mechanisms for stabilizing sand and reducing, again, erosion, energy, stuff like that. Moving beyond beach nourishment and vegetation on dunes, we have breakwaters. Now we're starting to get into some more engineered and constructed solutions, but nothing as extreme as straight up seawalls. So we have breakwaters. They're typically parallel to shore. They can be exposed through the entire tidal cycle from high to low, or they can be submerged. They can be, solid, all the way the length of the breakwater, or they can be broken up and discontinuous So there's submerged, discontinuous breakwaters. At the end of the day, they're offshore structures. And then moving off to the right, all the way to the end of the screen, the last one that I wanted to suggest are groins. And, we're familiar with groins. We've seen groins before. They exist on Virginia Key. They were put there years back. There's actually a groin at the southern end of Bill Baggs, Cape Florida Beach, just before you get to the lighthouse. I think that was put there in 1987 as a mechanism for holding back sand that was essentially flowing off into Cape Florida Channel. But nevertheless, these are options that could be viable for us as we look at our beach and shoreline protection program, as it may be funded through GO bonds or some other funding mechanism, external grant, or the Army Corps of Engineers beach protection program, which is another topic that we'll get into just a little bit later. But nevertheless, the remainder of this little discussion is going to be focused on our beach nourishment and on the concept of a submerged offshore structure, should it be found to be viable, and the sort of shoreline protection approach that is permittable because it doesn't cause more harm than good. So going back to our beach nourishment strategy, or our overall shoreline protection strategy, it's a two-pronged strategy which continues with the beach nourishments that have been undertaken all the way back starting in 1969. And this is sort of a little historical overview of the various nourishments that were done. Back in 1969 and in 1987, there were two relatively significant beach nourishment events that were undertaken by the Army Corps of Engineers in collaboration with Miami-Dade County. And this was before I think the village was actually incorporated. Both of those nourishments obtained sand from borrow areas offshore of Crandon and offshore of basically Cape Florida. Subsequent to those nourishment events, when the village basically took over control of the beaches, I guess after incorporation, the next major beach nourishment event was undertaken in 2002. There was a small one in 1998, which is this little event here. I don't know if people can see my cursor, but this little event here in 1998 was, I believe, undertaken by the village. And subsequently in 2002, 2008, 2012, and most recently in 2017, these nourishments were on the order of between like 30 and 40,000 cubic yards. And they were achieved, excuse me, they were achieved by hauling sand by trucks from a sand mine. I believe it's located in Central Florida. Now, whether or not moving forward we'll ever be able to tap these offshore borrow areas for sand remains to be seen. That's a discussion that will have to come up when we start planning for renewing our joint coastal permit with the state that is expiring, I believe, in 2022 or 24. But nevertheless, look, the future is going to require continual nourishment events. And there's no getting around that. The next one is already scheduled up for February of 2021. And all the preliminary work for that is being undertaken right now. The third year of biological monitoring that is required by permit for the 2017 nourishment is being completed. and a lot of the data that is being collected for meeting that permanent requirement is also being used to inform the design of the 2021 nourishment event. But under this shoreline protection program that is under our resiliency Go Bond umbrella, we've planned for a 23 nourishment event and a 26 nourishment event. And that's part of the, excuse me, the $23.3 million that we believe might be accessed through a Go Bond, if that's the best way to go at the time. Those two events, 2023 and 2026, would be funded that way if we were not to be able to secure external funding, say, from the state, as we have for the 2021 event. So that's the deal with nourishments. We're going to have to continue doing them, and beyond 2026, in perpetuity, we're going to have to deal with beach nourishment. Now, in parallel with beach nourishment, because we're talking about erosion and energy and managing energy and erosion, we're considering doing a submerged offshore structure. Now, what does that mean, a submerged offshore structure? Well, I mean, these are examples of a submerged offshore structure. Now, it turns out that these are based on the deployment of a network of concrete reef balls. And it's not fiction. Up in the upper left-hand corner of this slide, you see a barge putting out reef balls off of St. Lucie County. And this is an FPL reef breakwater project. And it's meant to reduce beach erosion that's associated with the cooling canal for the nuclear power plant up there. And it's being done in conjunction with dune restoration. Now, I believe this is in the vicinity of Hutchinson Island. And then on the right side of this screen is another example of a deployment of reef balls as an offshore structure. And essentially it's to create an artificial reef that has the same function as the natural reefs that I mentioned earlier would be first line of defense. And this is actually the largest fringing breakwater, artificial reef breakwater system in the world. And it was done in Maiden Island, Antigua. And to the lower left, you see one of those reef balls that's now being colonized over time by soft corals and hard corals. And what I like about this particular picture and gives me hope relative to our concept or our idea of doing an offshore structure is that these reef balls are actually deployed in a seagrass bed, which would be very, very similar to the seagrass bed environment that we have not too far offshore of our beach. So this is being done, and it's being done in Florida, and there's other examples of submerged structures. Now, what you see here, the pictures are actual deployments of submerged structures, and then the image in the middle is what was produced by Moffitt and Nickel in the beach management feasibility study that was completed back, I believe, in 2018, where they had done a generalized analysis of the wave field that the shoreline of Key Biscayne is exposed to, and they did some mathematical analysis of that wave field and whether or not a offshore structure would be effective in reducing energy coming ashore onto the beach. And what they found was that actually it would be. And so they sort of sketched out this concept of 4 different submerged discontinuous structures that might be akin to deploying reef balls and creating an artificial reef, as I showed previously. Or it might be actually something similar to Sunny Isles Beach which is the picture in the upper right-hand corner of the screen with that red oval that circles what are essentially two 375-foot long submerged breakwaters that are not reef balls. They're actually big granite blocks that weigh anywhere between like 3 and 14 tons. And funny thing about this picture is I got it from someone yesterday that was sending me a picture of a water spout yesterday off of Golden Beach, and the village attorney was mentioning that he thought Sunny Isles Beach in Golden Beach had a submerged breakwater. And I'm looking at this video, and sure enough, look at that. There are the submerged breakwaters. I couldn't believe it. So it's not an impossible solution. It's not an outrageous solution to reducing energy being focused onto the beach and driving erosion. Now, it's not necessarily easy, but that's part of the reason why we're looking at Go Bond or other mechanisms to fund the analyses that are needed to do the permitting and do the construction and do the mitigation. But it's worth considering. Now, the thing is, it should be understood, the reason why you have to analyze it as much as you do is because the dynamics of shorelines are very, very complex. I mentioned just some of the many factors that need to be considered. And there are problems. I mean, it is possible to do more harm than good. And these are just examples of areas where submerged breakwaters were deployed or groins were deployed to minimize erosion. And in truth, what happened is you surely increased deposition behind the breakwater, and that's what you see. These formations are called tumulus, where the sand starts creeping up towards the breakwater, and then over to the right. This is actually off of Miami Beach. I don't remember how many years ago it was, but I think this was a breakwater attempt that was then removed because of the obvious impacts to the beach, to the shoreline profile. You see increased deposition to the point that the beach has now merged with the breakwater, and on the down gradient side of the breakwaters, you have significant erosion. Well, that's a problem, And then in the lower picture, you see groins that were put out to reduce the movement of sediment along the shore. And again, what you see is on one side of the groin, you get erosion. On the other side of the groin, you get deposition, or what's called accretion. So, offshore structures can be useful ways to go in terms of shoreline protection. And I think based on the analysis that was done by Moffitt and Nickel in 2017 or 2018, whatever it was, it seems like it might be a viable way to go. And that's why we're exploring it as seriously as we are. But it's not to say that they don't have impacts. They impact sediment transport, they impact water circulation, they have impacts to seagrasses, which need to be mitigated. And you're also creating new hard bottom habitat. And so then also the challenge being permitting with the Army Corps of Engineers, the FDEP, DERM, et cetera. Nevertheless, something that we're considering, and I think this is a kind of a crazy slide. There's a lot of text on it, which I don't particularly like, but it's important because for people who are going to look at this via the vkbresilience.org website, it's important to have the information. We are trying to get ourselves integrated into the Army Corps of Engineers feasibility study. And that feasibility study is sort of like step one towards a 50-year beach protection program that Miami-Dade County has been a part of and is up for renewal. And presently, the feasibility study is ongoing, but it doesn't include Key Biscayne. And we've been pushing very hard. The mayor has, other council members have, I have, our legislative representatives have been pushing to get a waiver approved by the Army Corps of Engineers to accept us into the feasibility program, such that moving forward into the future, we don't have to struggle with how to fund shoreline protection. We have support from the federal government. So this is a little bit of an update. Thus far, the waiver has moved out of the Jacksonville Army Corps of Engineers office, has gone to Washington to the Assistant Secretary of the Army, and we're waiting for approval of that waiver. Okay. Now, if we get the waiver and we get included into the feasibility study, then at that point we'll be working with the Army Corps of Engineers to provide them data to generate what is essentially, what is essentially called a tentatively selected plan. And then that plan goes through reviews and approvals and whatnot. And then ultimately it has to go before the Chief of Engineers for sign off. And if it is signed off on and a project actually can get undertaken, then the first opportunity for authorization is in 2022. Funds may be appropriated in 2023, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we'll be seeing anything getting done anytime, before say 2024, 2025 or later. And in the meantime, we still have a beach that we got to manage. And this is a long process. It requires time and effort and engagement. And it still also requires money because, even if we get integrated into it, they support to the tune of about 65%, but we still have 35% of financial support that we have to provide on our end. So what if not? If a project gets authorized through the Water Resources Development Act in 2022 at the earliest, first construction phase could be funded in 2023, but that's at the absolute earliest, assuming that a new project we're going to begin before the expiration of the Miami-Dade County authorization at the end of 2024. So, this is a long-term proposition, even if we were to get included into the core project. And if included, like I said, we'd still have to come up with 35% of the cost. And there's a lot of continual communication that will be required with the Corps, and there's congressional authorizations that are required, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not an easy process. It's not a quick process, but nevertheless, it's something that we're considering because we still have to do shoreline protection, looking forward in the face of sea level rise and more intense storms. And we're always looking for additional sources of funding such that we don't necessarily have to depend on the GO bond. Now, if we don't get in and we don't have other resources, financial resources to push forward our projects under this program, this shoreline protection program, and the economic climate is most favorable for funds to come from GOB, then that's a tool in our toolbox or an arrow in our quiver, and we can shoot it if we need it. So the GO bond, I think people who came into the last town hall where Benjamin was talking about the finances behind the GO bond, this is sort of that same table, but with a focus on protecting the villages, beaches, and shoreline. $23.3 million, like I talked about earlier. This would be tapped in a series. So the first series would be $3 million, and that would be focused on funding the 2023 beach nourishment and the initial analysis, like deep hydrodynamic and sediment transport analysis of the breakwater, which would be required before we could ever push towards approaching the permitting agencies. And again, we have submitted a grant for that breakwater analysis. We don't know if we're going to get that $520,000 grant. In the event that we don't get the grant, GO bond again is a potential mechanism for funding that analysis. That's Series 1 relative to Shoreline Protection Program. Under Series 2, which would be some 3 years down the road, we would then be funding the 2026 beach nourishment and completing the breakwater analysis, and then starting to venture into the permitting / design of the breakwater. Then in the third series, which would be 3 years later, we start looking at breakwater construction And then in the last series, 7.9 million would be dedicated towards breakwater mitigation. And it may seem high, but it's a combination of completing the construction and dealing with the mitigation of all the seagrasses that would be impacted by putting hard structures offshore. This is a sort of breakdown of the whole 23.3 million of it would be potentially funded through the GOB, and that is oriented specifically on the truck hauls at about 50,000 cubic yards, which is around 3.4 million estimated. The offshore breakwater hard costs, 10.3 million, soft costs, 2.1 million, seagrass mitigation specifically, 7.5 million. That's 23.3 million. And then looking forward 50 years and figuring, okay, we have a breakwater now and our erosion rates have gone down. We plan for, say, 6 nourishment events over 50 years at $3.4 million each. That's around $21.25 million with associated seagrass mitigations because of sand migration from nourishment event, 4 of those at 20 million. So that basically adds up to 41.25 million, which when you add that to the 23.3 million that might have been obtained through the GOB, makes for a grand total of 64.5 million for shoreline protection estimated. Now, again, if we can get external funds from elsewhere, then we don't have to, lean on the GOB as hard. But nevertheless, this protection needs to get done, period, the end. And there aren't that many options. We got nourishments that we know we have to do, and we have this concept of an offshore breakwater that hopefully will come up aces, and there you go. So that being said, I'm going to end there. It's a lot of information. People will be able to review it, think about it, digest it, ask questions about it through the website. And I just want to point out the little groin that's in this red circle that was put out in 1987. It's effective. It's been holding back the sand on Bilbag's Beach for sure. But again, there is this down gradient erosional situation, which is part of the reason why they're hard as heck to get permitted. And most of the groins that exist right now are relics from decades ago when we didn't really know better. So we had initially seawalls. Wow, those seawalls didn't last as long as we would hope. They crumbled. What did we do? We put up some groins. Oh, those groins, they have their problems too. They help in some places, but they hurt in others, and now are hard to permit. And so we move on to other concepts like, submerged, discontinuous structures and things like that. So that's what I got for you for tonight. And well, I guess we'll take some questions. Peter, you're up.
Good evening, Doctor. As of right now, we do have one caller with a phone number ending in 298. Caller, you are live. Caller, please press *6 on your phone to unmute yourself. Phone number ending in 298. Please, if you wish to speak, please press *6 to unmute yourself.
While the caller hopefully can unmute him or herself to speak, I would also like to thank and acknowledge Councilmember McCormick has also joined us. Good evening and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I had some technical difficulties. I've bounced in and out a few times, but I found this really informative, and I hope our residents have as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Zamini, I have a question if I can jump in real quick. The largest beach nourishment that I saw that you had on there was 50,000 cubic yards. And I know that a couple of years ago, we spoke a little bit about going for a much larger.
Hello, Peter?
Yes, hello?
I'm unmuted, I guess.
Yes, you are. You
We
are
can
live
hear
on
you.
TV, sir.
Let me go first, and I'll jump on after.
Okay. Don Ellisberg. I had a question for you, or observation. You had this whole list of different sand dumps over the umpteen years.
Mm-hmm.
But my recollection is that in 1998 was the huge one where they ran pipes up and down the beach and out into the ocean for their sand dump. They didn't truck it in.
That well, that's correct. That did actually happen. But I think that was 1987.
There was a huge one in 1987. Okay. And then there was another one in 1998 or 9, something like that. They took a year to put pipes out, and then and I think that was one where ultimately they ran into seagrass trouble and had to pay a couple $1 million to somebody to mitigate the seagrass.
Right. I did hear about that.
Right.
Yeah, I did hear about that. Actually, our council was talking to me about that yesterday, and that is one of the reasons why using those offshore borrow areas are as challenging as they are legally.
I agree with that. It was simply that if you really should fix your timeline or whatever it is to demonstrate when the village really engaged in some substantial stuff, because after that they got scared and have only done trucking.
Right. Well, I'll be happy to revisit the historical record and see how I can update it.
It really has to do with the fact that when they did it in 1998, all right, that was the sort of supplemental replacement of the seawalls. It was after that really that the dunes started to shape.
Mm-hmm.
They were ostensibly a replacement for Andrew, so forth. But I remember being here in 1998 after they got rid of the pipes. It was still a flat beach.
Right.
And it wasn't until...
I'll be happy to check that out.
It's a historical thing. And the other point I wanted to make, really in terms of the projects you've laid out, frankly, you just gave us a terrific course in beach management. My question is, after all of these years of playing with all this stuff, don't we have a direction that all the people searching the ocean floor have come up with? This is not, it's not as though nobody's done nothing.
Agreed. I mean, that's why we've been continuing on with the nourishments, and in some areas, offshore structures are being considered. But again, it all depends on the environment that you're trying to deploy them in and whether or not they're appropriate in that particular location. In some areas, it may be beneficial. In other areas, maybe not so much.
I get it completely.
Yeah.
But my question really is after everybody has played with this for so many years, don't you have a thought as to where the sunken ship should go versus where something else should go?
Well, look, Moffitt and Nickel did, excuse me, Moffitt and Nickel did an analysis, and it was a very high level, sort of 50,000 foot analysis that indicated that offshore structures may be a viable way to go. And they actually, sort of suggested where they might be able to be deployed. But between that and what's required to actually do it, is a lot of work and a lot of analysis, because the environment out there is super complicated. Okay. The dynamics are really tough. So
I don't want to make a federal case out of it. Thanks for the input.
You bet.
All right, our next caller is going to be phone number 549. Caller, please press *6 to unmute yourself. You are live.
Hi, this is Melissa White, 370 Heather Lane. I just want to thank you for one of the best presentations I've seen on our shoreline. From historical and knowledge, it was wonderful. And I want to clarify, I have a couple questions related to the project. There's some misinformation, so I just wanted to understand. There are 3 buckets, is that correct, in terms of the GO bond and 3 projected budgets for the spending of the GO bond dollars?
That would be correct. And Andrea, maybe you can take this one, but yes, there are 3 buckets or 3 programs, one of which is shoreline protection, the other, which has its own sort of budget, and then the other 2 would be sea level rise and flooding, which has a lot to do with roadway improvements and how those roadway improvements relate to stormwater system upgrades that are paid for outside of the GO bond. And then the 3rd bucket is the hardening infrastructure. Each of those buckets have their own budgets, which total.
And my understanding was that came up to about 98 million. Is that correct?
Yeah.
The other question I had was related to Benjamin's presentation and the financing mechanism. With the debt cap still in place, there's really no difference between the way that debt is done now. It will be capped at approximately 82 million, but we'll have the ability as voters on Key Biscayne and residents to make the decision to get a better interest rate on the financing. Is that correct from Benjamin's presentation?
So I believe Benjamin's with us, but there we are.
Yeah, that is correct as it stands now with our current debt cap. However, because we anticipate the series of bonds being issued over a 10 to 12 year period, we can also anticipate 2 things happening. One is that our existing debt is going to mature and get off the books, allowing more potential room for issuing debt. And the second is, in 10 years, our total assessed value will look different than it is today. So even with some very conservative assumptions of growth, we anticipate having more room under the current debt capacity.
Wonderful. So would this be almost like just investing in our investment as residents and being able to put in my mind, there wouldn't be a better marketing plan than putting the infrastructure work into making our properties more resilient.
It's undoubtedly true that the these improvements are essential for the village's long-term health and stability.
Wonderful. Thank you guys so much. Great presentation.
Thank you,
Melissa.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, please press *9 now to be heard.
I think while we wait, Councilmember Moss was wanting to ask a question.
Yeah, it's a small question. So 50,000 cubic yards of sand. I think we were thinking at one point that if we did breakwaters, we may want to go even up to like a 200,000, something very large that would maintain that sand in there. I think that might be something that we might want to entertain or look at. I don't know how much this would change in the cost and stuff like that, or this might be farther out, but I just want to see if this is something that you guys are looking at.
Well, I think it's something that's worth considering. We right now are limited by our permits as to how much sand we could put during a given nourishment event. And I think the permitted limit is, maybe Jake knows better, but I think the permitted limit is 36, either 36 or 31, 31,000 cubic yards. And that we're sort of stuck with that unless we were to ask for a specific permit modification. But since the permits are basically expiring in I guess it's a couple years. Our Durham permit was extended because of COVID-19 for an extra year. So that expires in May of 2023. Our DEP permit, I think, and our core permit expire in 2024. At the time that those expire and have to be renewed to continue with our shoreline protection, that would be the opportunity to try and maybe up the amount of cubic yards that you could put during any given nourishment event. The challenge that you have, though, are the impacts that you could potentially have on seagrass beds that are just offshore. And part of the reason we're limited is because they don't want the edge of tow of the ocean side portion of the nourishment to encroach onto the onto the seagrasses. And so that's kind of like why we are a bit stuck with the size nourishments that we currently have. Jake, I don't know if I got that 100% correct, but if you know more about it that is different, please chime in.
That sounds about right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question, please? Or Dr. Samimi, sorry. I would like you started to talk about it, and I'd like you, for clarification of the residents, to tell them exactly some of the other restrictions that exist with us trying to get beach renourishment. Since I've been on council, I know that the sand that's going to go on the beaches actually is less than what we even were permitted for because of some of those restrictions. And then even acquiring sand right now is a hugely difficult thing to do.
Right.
You talked about the seagrass. We have seagrass that comes in very close. So when we do disturb it, there's, I think, 3 agencies in the state that we have to pass permitting. Is that correct? Also?
Yeah, as far as I know, and again, Jake, maybe you can help me out here, but for sure we have to deal with Durham, and for sure we have to deal with FDEP. To the extent that we have to deal with Fish and Wildlife, I'm not sure. They work with DEP and with Durham, but I don't know if they themselves are a regulatory body or a permitting body, but they definitely weigh into the equation. And we also have to deal with the Army Corps. So seagrass is a major issue. Another major issue is sand sources. Right now, well, up until now, I think we've only had one sand source, the Ortuna mine, I believe it is, in Central Florida. But just recently, Moffitt and Nickel submitted a request to have 2 or 3 additional sand mines approved for us to get sand from. They had done a compatibility analysis on the sand from those sources, and apparently they are compatible. So that will give us an additional amount of flexibility. And here's the other kicker, which is how we deal with seaweed and the integration of seaweed into the beach, which is a slippery road to a long discussion. But the fact of the matter is, if you integrate too much seaweed into the beach, you cause a couple different problems. One of which we're finding more and more about is this elevated bacteria levels. But the other is that you've now integrated so much organic material into the sand that you've essentially created soil, not sand anymore. I mean, soil is sand, is like a mineral sand with a lot of organic material mixed into it. That's what makes it soil, and that's what makes it nutritious. So now we've been integrating, seaweed into the sand, and now we're sort of turning the sand into soil. And now we've changed the composition of what the beach is, which then makes it incompatible with the sources of sand that we use to do our beach nourishments. So that's another landmine that we have to be really mindful of, and is a challenge to our shoreline protection strategy.
Yes, I guess what I wanted people to understand is it isn't just a funding barrier. There's a lot of barriers dealing with renourishment of our beaches. And the one other thing about the Army Corps is they can bypass some of this permitting, and they may be able to actually put more sand on our beaches than we would be allowed to as our own municipality, which is why the 1987 nourishment was so strong, is it actually went above and beyond anything we could ever hope to do as our own entity. And I just wanted to make sure that we factor that in when we look at what we actually can do as we move forward.
That's a very good point. Thank you for bringing it up.
Thanks.
All right, we do have another caller, phone number ending in 307. Caller, please press *6 now to be heard. You are live. Caller again, please dial *6. Caller, you are live.
I'm dialing *6 and you're done. I'm dialing *6, you're dialing *6. Okay, am I on the air, so to speak?
Yes, sir.
All right, so I want to correct the record about the dunes on the beach. So the weekend Oswald was shot, 63. I vividly remember being at a picnic at Crandon and killing a rattlesnake in the sand dunes, which I stripped and had forever. So there was clearly sand dunes in Crandon in the 60s. I then spent most of the 70s surfing up in Jupiter. And up until about 10 years ago, I watched them pump sand all summer into Jupiter Inlet Beach. And then a nor'easter came through, and in a weekend it was all gone. So my vision is we're pumping, literally pushing sand against the tide and using a 30-year loan to do it, which seems counterproductive, but that's another day. Specifically, it sounds like we have a very, I don't know, there doesn't seem to be a real plan here. There's just sort of a $64,000 question, and I'm hearing beach renourishment at $23 million. It's going to last till 2026. I'm curious where the line is drawn between beach maintenance, which is clearly not a capital, and beach renourishment, how it differs. Right? Why would it be eligible for bond money and say seaweed not? It's just on a different time scale. And I had another question about the amount of the bond money. So what would be the reason if the earliest we're going to do anything, and that's a $3 million study, is going to be in 2023, why would I vote to tie up my bond capacity now? Why wouldn't I wait till this project is more formed? And in doing so, would you say that the undergrounding project is shovel ready? I think the sewer line, the stormwaters are shovel ready. If I'm not, I haven't seen the study, but I think that's already moving forward. And the road improvements, it seems like that would be the way to go, that you're going to tear up a road and put in a big pipe, and then you could put in utilities and everything while you're at it. Why wouldn't we focus on that project now and leave these other things for a vote later on? Anybody?
Yeah, I'll take it. I'll take it. What was
Why
your
don't you
name?
take a crack? You can take a crack at part of it, and I'm happy to take a crack at some of the other stuff. And quite frankly, there's so much there that I'd almost appreciate having that in an email so that I could take a day to really sort of flesh an answer out. However, why don't you go ahead, Andrea?
You have it on, you have it on the record. That's why I called.
Thank you.
Andrea.
Yes, I'm sorry. Can you I didn't catch your name, sir.
Charles.
Charles. Oh, hi, Charles. How are you?
Hi, Andrea. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. So some of the questions that you asked do fall outside of our wheelhouse to the extent that as employees of the village, we do not advocate for or against the bond, and that's a principle that is very important that we adhere to. It's an ethical standard that we're held to, and we hold ourselves to the highest standards. So with regard to the policy—
No, my question was administrative. It was just about the bond capacity. I mean, do we load up capacity with this vote and we're stuck? Or anyway, I wasn't asking you to tell me whether or not I should do it. I was asking you about capacity. If we have, just for the sake of argument, we have $150 million worth of projects, and this $100 million vote, does that tie up capacity?
So general obligation bond pledges the full faith and credit of the village. And I will tell you that based on all the information we know, the cost of the resilience initiatives is far in excess of any current capacity we have with the restrictions that we have in place. So the question as to which projects are the priority for the community and the council needs to be determined. And I think the ballot question as approved by council has identified these 3 bond program areas as the priority. And within each of those bond programs, there are a series of projects. So I'm sorry?
As the administrator, which would you say would you move forward on first if it was passed to you as an administrator, given the metrics you have?
Right. I think the most important thing for us is that we do this in a methodical, logical way that is cost effective and as least disruptive to the residents that it impacts. So our goal here in designing these projects and these programs in the long term is, if we're going to break up a street, if we're going to go underground to either whatever the impetus is, and right now you're right, the main driver right now are the stormwater utility improvements, and there is an item on the agenda next week. Actually, there's a few items that are going to advance those projects. So as the stormwater improvements move through through that implementation, while the roads are up, there is an opportunity when we button them back up, as Dr. Samimi likes to say, to finish things off by doing the complete streets and at the same time while the road is up, to address the undergrounding of the utilities in that project region also makes sense from a business perspective.
I'm also going to just jump in here for a second. I want to, before you come back, I want to add to what Andrea just said, which is in that table that I showed of the geo bond at a glance, there were 4 series, of which in the first series, shoreline protection is one part of the series. The other parts of the series are projects being undertaken under the sea level rise and flooding program, which relates to street improvements. And then relative to the 3rd program under the resilience bond umbrella which is hardened infrastructure, are projects associated with undergrounding. So in that one series of 4 series that were depicted in that table, there would be a set of projects from each of the 3 programs kind of being undertaken simultaneously. So just because we're talking about
hearing
right now,
I don't have the charts. I'm trying to do this from memory.
Excuse me?
But what I'm hearing is that I'm trying to do this from memory because I don't have access to visuals. I'm hearing that sea level rise is the roads is one bucket, infrastructure is another bucket. So we're going to mix those 2 buckets while we're doing a previously approved bond project of the stormwater, which I guess could qualify as sea level rise. I guess that's more or less.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you see where I'm going with this. Even within the buckets you have now, never mind. We'll talk about this another day. I don't want to get too deep in the woods. Thank you. I had one more question. This is not totally related, but let's just, for example, I've asked this question before about how many votes do we need to float a bond? So it's a supermajority, right? Once the bond is approved for 100 million and we want to do a tranche for 64 million, that's voted on by 5 sitting members of the council.
So there are many factors that go into there are several series of events that would need to happen once the referendum goes through. So we couldn't happily, Charles, get with you and go through step by step. I think it would be in everyone's best interest if Jeff DiCarlo Bond Counsel was with us, because each step, depending on the magnitude and the series and the complexity of the projects, and the financial, the FA, the financial advisor, there are many moving parts. So depending on the way that we progress, the legislation that's required and the decisions that will be presented before council will change.
Let me go at it the other way.
Isn't it safe to say that, though? I'm sorry, Charles.
Let's go I'll go the other way. Katie, how are you?
As a council member, I will tell you that when we vote on the financing, it has to be a supermajority, and it does require a 5-2 vote and not a 4-3 when that time comes, which is your question, correct?
Exactly. I'm going to go the other extreme now. Let's say we've got the road open and we want to do the street lights, which is actually a part of the undergrounding that I read in the study, but it's not included. So let's say the council outside the bond wants to put another $5 million in the pot to get the street lights put in while the roads are opened, for the sake of argument. So it's not a bond money that they're voting on. Then we go to this scenario where it only requires a majority of those present. And I think I made an extreme example of 4 people show up, that qualifies as a quorum under the charter. 3 disqualify themselves for conflict. 1 person could conceivably move that project forward. Is that correct, or is that a hypothetical?
I asked that, you asked that in an email, and I referred that
never got an answer.
To the attorney at the time, and he told me that you were incorrect in your analysis. I'm not going to be able to, I can send you what he sent me.
Answer the email, it'd be great. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time. Bye.
All right, we have no other callers at this time, Madam Manager.
Thank you very much. So we're about 5 minutes past schedule, which is totally fine. We're trying to keep these town halls to a nice succinct 1 hour for our viewers. So with that, if there are any follow-up questions, this presentation, the PowerPoint presentation, as well as a video recording will be available through the village's website. We will be re-airing this content on channel 77. Feel free to reach out to me or Dr. Samimi or Jake or any of your council members to discuss what the program is, what the projects are. We are here to answer questions and to serve the residents in the community here at Key Biscayne. And we thank you for your time this evening, and we look forward to seeing you at the next town hall.
I'd also like to just reiterate that all of this is going to be on the www.vkbresilience.org website that was established by the village specifically for the Resilience GOB program. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for adding that. And again, thank you to our elected officials who have joined us and for everybody's participation. We look forward to continuing to educate and inform the community, and take care of yourselves. Thank you.